Oh, okay, we're live. Okay. Uh, Hi, everyone. I apologize that I'm not there in the room with you. I hope to be in the room with you soon, although that I stopped for a pit stop. We'll see what happens. But I mainly want to talk about what we have been doing to organize October 26th and how that's included with why I'm not there right now. See, we are going to have people coming into our event, which is really a national event. We have people coming in from places like Ohio and now North Carolina. We have people coming in from the surrounding tri-state area, Long Island, Connecticut, New Jersey. I know people from Pennsylvania who are coming. I can't hear you at all in the Bronx office. Okay, somebody's got to unmute the computer in the office. That's probably what it is. So I will wait till Adrian tells me he can hear me in the Bronx office. In the meanwhile, for the people who are watching live, who I will be addressing right now, for people who don't know, we're having an event on October 26th. And This is going to be an event that will be taking place in Manhattan, Midtown South, and we are having people like Scott Ritter, Larry Wilkerson, Jimmy Dore, our friends over at Due Dissidence will be coming and speaking live at the event. And Good now. Okay, great. All right. So for our friends who are watching on the internet only and have no idea what's going on in the background, I'm currently not at the Bronx office. I am currently outside of the Bronx, and I couldn't make it back in time to introduce the class as I normally would. Um, Today, there was a series of um, good discussions that have been taking place. Of course, as usual, we come off the International Peace Coalition call where people come together. This is every Friday morning at 11 a.m. And Diane gave a passionate plea for what we're doing on October 26th to get that room filled. It's going to be an indoor rally that will have Scott Ritter, Larry Wilkerson, Jimmy Dore, our friends from Due Dissidence, and a bunch of other names that you will recognize. Dennis Fritz um, is another name that we hope will be joining us as well, and other names that are in the works, yet to be announced, that will be announced closer as we get to the event, which is exactly 1 week away. And this is our major intervention that we have going on right now. And all of our efforts should be focused on getting people to the event on the 26th. I can say for certain there are going to be about 6 people coming in from North Carolina. There are at least 2 people I know of that are coming in from Ohio. There are people coming in as far away as um, Butler, Pennsylvania, Pittsburgh. There are people coming in from upstate New York, from Long Island, from all parts of New Jersey. And I even heard of some people flying in from the Midwest coming out just for this event alone. This is very much a national rally. This is something that which should be, people were organizing their time and their schedule and they're traveling to get to Washington or to get to New York when Scott Ritter was doing his event on September 28th. And that's exactly the same kind of mobilization that we need right now going on. And so I would urge everybody in the room in the Bronx right now to focus on getting 2, 3, 5, 10 other people to this event that we have going on in New York City. Um, Finally, I just wanted to add some kind of quick reports here as to what I've been doing over the week. So for people who may not know, we got an impromptu meeting at the United Nations, and last weekend, as in Saturday, Sunday, and Monday, um, Dr. Mark Perlmutter, Dr. Feroz, a nurse whose name is Lana, and another doctor from New Jersey. They were all in Gaza. They were doing a tour of the New York area. They spoke at NYU, they spoke at Columbia Medical, they spoke at Riverside Church. And I was helping them around, I was taking them from one place to another. It all just kind of happened last minute. And I found out that I would be having a meeting at the United Nations. It was just all happening improvised. And so what happened was on Monday, when I got the news that this was happening, I called the doctors and I said, "Are you guys still in town? Come with me to this meeting." And they did. In Presenza, a international press has written about this meeting, and this all happened just in the last week. And I'm saying this because every day there has to be something new being done to develop our event, which is happening 8 days from now, really a week from now, because we're now approaching the end of today. And for those of you who are in the office right now or who want to come out or want to be involved in the Bronx, I will be out tomorrow morning. And if people want to know more details on that, they should speak with Lynn Speed, who's in the room, or you should contact contact me or my office or our website if you're watching online and you want to come out and canvass with us tomorrow. We are going to be doing a major event. We'll be doing a rally. We'll be handing out my cards. We'll be putting up posters. And I will be there tomorrow. And I think if you want to know information on how to join us, where to find us, definitely contact Lynn Speed or go through our website and sign up to volunteer. We are in the last 20 days of the campaign, and every day matters. And tomorrow is going to be a very big day, so you don't want to miss that. And finally, I want to introduce Dennis Speed, who is doing a continuation of his class series on Edgar Poe. I'm hoping that he's in the room right now, so hopefully this will be seamless when I pass this off to him. Last week, I introduced this as a method in how to think. And after that class, I think I'm a little clearer on how I could convince anybody to watch this class. And so for those of you who are watching online, and why you should share this class with other people, why you should get others to watch the replay of this. See, we are in a period of historical revisionism right now. You know, why is it that people can get away with lying? Well, because people are so confused with what is and isn't true, what is a lie and is a lie, that people have given up trying to decipher it, have given up trying to figure it out, and have just decided to abandon it altogether. And we saw examples of this with Edgar Poe, the manipulations of his writings, the rewritings of his writings, completely distorting everything he stood for. And so last week's class was great. People can watch that on the replay. If you just scroll down on our YouTube channel on Declaring Independence or on our Twitter, and I'm excited to continue this dialogue. Last week's dialogue took us into space. It took us into trying to figure out how fast are we actually moving. I won't spoil the rest, but it was a lively class, and I'm really excited for this week's class. And so I will be watching live with all of you. Hopefully, I'll be able to make it towards the end in person. But for now, I think I will just pass it off to Dennis Speed, who is standing right there. Hello, Dennis. It is good to see you, and it is good not to be the big face on the screen anymore. So I will leave it to you.
All right, great. All right, so as was said, we've done a few of these classes. I've been talking about the maligned personality from the Bronx, Edgar Poe, who actually didn't die here. His family was located here when he left and died. This is his last place of residence in the United States. Poe, among other things, was a certain kind of genius, an American kind of genius, who was very controversial in his time, but who represents something essential to whether or not we happen to survive, including in the next several weeks. The reason for that is that there are thinkers in history that are part of a select group, which doesn't have to be select, but they become select because their dedication is to making things clear to people to whom they are not supposed to be clear. They spend their lives working in that realm. And because they do that, they, on one hand, achieve something and have a gift, but they have a gift for which they have to pay a price. Now, that's not because that price would have to be paid if people were, to whom they are trying to address themselves, were more aware of what they were doing. But that's not really the problem of the person. It's a problem of the culture. And we are trying to solve that problem in the culture. People often, when they talk about Shakespeare plays, they talk about tragic heroes. There are rarely tragic heroes in any Shakespeare plays. The tragedies are the people in the Shakespeare plays. The hero is tragic because he or she is just like everyone else. And that's the problem of today. For example, our problem is not our tragic leaders. Our problem is our tragic population. And the leaders are just like people. Now, some people believe that that's how you campaign to become a leader. I'm just like you. When you have a society that does that, that society will plunge itself into darkness, will plunge itself into self-destruction and never see it, like the one you're in. So the United States, for example, has gone from being the most productive society in human history during particularly the period of the late 30s and mid to the mid 40s to being the most indebted nation in history, and a nation which has literally abdicated industrial, manufacturing, agricultural, and scientific leadership. Well, there's several others. People like to blame China. They like to blame Russia. And they blame any place else that they wish to blame. The truth of the matter is that the American people were caused to do it to themselves by what's euphemistically called intelligence agencies that convinced them to do this. This came out of the educational institutions, particularly what's called higher education, which primarily because of being English speaking, came out of London, the city of London, and the city of London's junior partner, Boston. The Boston University system, in particular, the Harvard and related complex, sometimes called the Ivy League schools. But this is not an attack on what people call woke culture. That's not what I'm attacking. I'm attacking something very, very, very different. And it is the intellectual tradition that talks about Aristotle and certain other figures as being the paragons of thought, logic as being the paragon of human thought, mathematics as being the paragon of human thought, and things like artificial intelligence as being the paragons of human thought. These are the opposite. This is where your problem is. And until that problem is recognized for what it is, it would be impossible to prevent, for example, the United States from self-destructing. Virtually everybody that's called a leader, not because of the fact that they're called leaders, but because they won't question these things, runs into various problems. There are some people who are contradictory, and there's some people who are flawed, who are trying to arrive at certain right ideas. That is, for example, whatever you think of somebody like Elon Musk, and there are many bad things you can think about him, when you see the retrieval of the booster and how that happens, you have to realize that as an engineering feat is world historical. It's an engineering feat. It's not actually a feat in theory, in scientific theory. Scientific theory, as some other flawed people talk about it, is at a dead end, in physics in particular. Various people are talking about this in terms of quantum mechanics and other areas of physics and why you haven't really had anything since Einstein in terms of fundamental theory. But there has been tremendous engineering breakthroughs, there's no question about it. At the same time, you look at the person and you look at, and the issue here for me is not there's something wrong with Elon Musk. No, the issue is how could we as a society made up of people who are flawed and have talents and have capabilities, how do you combine those capabilities to move things ahead? What does progress mean, and what can it mean? Now, why Poe with respect to this? Poe wrote a lot of different stories. Some people credit him with sort of, people use the wrong term, like the father of the short story. That's not exactly right, but he did write stories which were intended to discuss questions that normally don't ever get proposed to people. So there's a story we're going to talk about tonight, read tonight, called A Descent into the Maelstrom. What will happen is that Kynan has a version of this, which is a little bit of a, it's a version that you can sort of hear. We're not going to play it. We're going to play a portion of it because there's a plot, but the plot is not what the story is about. The story is about something completely different, and it's at the beginning of the story. There's a motto for the story, and I'll just read it. And other people will be reading as well. That's why we gave you copies. The ways of God in nature, as in providence, are not our ways, nor are the models that we frame any way commensurate to the vastness, profundity, and unsearchableness of his works, which have a depth in them greater than the well of Democritus. And if in the story, for people who are online, in italics, so to emphasize it, is the phrase, which have a depth in them greater than the well of Democritus. All right. So maelstrom is like a whirlpool, giant whirlpool. And the story is going to be told of a man who's going to talk about why all of the descriptions of what this thing is have nothing to do with what it is. And that is what the story is about. What the story is about is that all descriptions of what the phenomenon is have nothing to do with what it is. And the reason he knows it is because he was in it. So that's the concept behind the story. Poe uses a word here I just want to refer to. And then we're going to play you a little bit of what the plot is, which is actually coincidental to the actual story. But so it works the other way around. He says that nor are the models that we frame in any way commensurate to the vastness, profundity, and unsearchableness of God's works. All right. I'm going to read you something, not in the story yet. We're going to come to that in a minute. But a friend of mine, now deceased, used to talk about, he formed our organization. His name was Lyndon LaRouche. And he had something to say, and he said this. He said, all work is intelligence, essentially. The only important work we do is intelligence work, which means that everybody ought to be in the deliberative process, those who are doing the daily processing, but everybody's involved. And then he talks about the problem of discovering something that you don't know the name of. So you're given something, you're trying to find something that you don't know. So how can you put a name in the computer to find it when you don't know its name? He talks about what he calls the incommensurable. What you're trying to do is you're trying to find something that doesn't fit the geometry of thought, the general axioms, the general outlook you have. It's outside of that, but it exists. Like, for example, if you say to people that the universe that we know of is 99% composed of plasma, which is a fourth state of matter, and that's what is being investigated in things like thermonuclear fusion, which has already produced a hydrogen bomb, which is very, threatens the Earth. That would seem to be confusing, but it's nonetheless true. So that's a physical fact, and it's a fourth state of matter. people think there's three: solids, liquids, gas, but there aren't. And there's more than a fourth state of matter. But now that's a physically, experimentally validatable fact, which is useful because what that allows you to do is to recognize that there's something that physically exists, which is different than what you've been taught physical existence is. Okay? So now that's what the realm is that we're going to be talking about. So kind of what we do is play that section from 13 minutes and 41 seconds in, just so we get the storyline kind of, and then we'll come back. This is not the beginning of the story. I'm playing you a section from the middle of the story. And then what we're going to do is read the beginning of the story.
Myself and my two brothers once owned a schooner-rigged smack of about 70 tons burden, with which we were in the habit of fishing among the islands beyond Moscow, nearly to Vega. In all violent eddies at sea there is good fishing, at proper opportunities if one has only the courage to attempt it. But among the whole of the Lofoten coastmen, we three were the only ones who made a regular business of going out to the islands, as I tell you. The usual grounds are a great way lower down to the southward. There fish can be got at all hours, without much risk, and therefore these places are preferred. The choice spots over here among the rocks, however, not only yield the finest variety, but in far greater abundance, so that we often got in a single day what the more timid of the craft could not scrape together in a week. In fact, we made it a matter of desperate speculation, the risk of life standing instead of labour, and courage answering for capital. We kept the smack in a cove about 5 miles higher up the coast than this, and it was our practice in fine weather to take advantage of the 15-minute slack to push across the main channel of the Moscow Strum, far above the pool, and then drop down upon anchorage somewhere near Otterholm or Sandflesen, where the eddies are not so violent as elsewhere. Here we used to remain until nearly time for slack water again, when we weighed and made for home. We never set out upon this expedition without a steady side wind for going and coming, one that we felt sure would not fail us before our return, and we seldom made a miscalculation upon this point. Twice during 6 years, we were forced to stay all night at anchor on a kind of a dead calm, which is a rare thing indeed just about here. And once we had to remain on the grounds nearly a week, starving to death, owing to a gale which blew up shortly after our arrival and made the channel too boisterous to be thought of. Upon this occasion, we should have been driven out to sea in spite of everything, for the whirlpools threw us round and round so violently that at length we fouled our anchor and dragged it, if it had not been that we drifted into one of the innumerable cross-currents, here today and gone tomorrow, which drove us under the lee of Fleeman, where, by good luck, we brought up. I could not tell you the 20th part of the difficulties we encountered on the ground. It's a bad spot to be in, even in good weather. But we made shift always to run the gauntlet of the Moscow Strum itself without accident. Although at times my heart's been in my mouth when we happened to be a minute or so behind or before the slack. The wind sometimes was not as strong as we thought it at starting. Then we made rather less sway than we could wish, while the current rendered the smack unmanageable. My eldest brother had a son 18 years old, and I had two stout boys of my own. These would have been a great assistance at such times in using the sweeps, as well as afterwards in fishing. But somehow, although we ran the risk ourselves, we had not the heart to let the young ones get into danger. For after all said and done, it was a horrible danger, and that's the truth. It's now within a few days of 3 years since what I am going to tell you occurred. It was on the 10th of July 18, a day which the people of this part of the world will never forget, for it was the one in which blew the most terrible hurricane that ever came out of the heavens. And yet all the morning, and indeed until late in the afternoon, there was a gentle and steady breeze from the southwest, while the sun shone brightly, so that the oldest seamen among us could not have foreseen what was to follow. The three of us, my two brothers and myself, had crossed over to the islands about 2 o'clock p.m., and soon nearly loaded the smack with fine fish, which we all remarked were more plenty that day than we had ever known them. It was just 7 by my watch when we weighed and started for home, so as to make the worst of the Strom at slackwater, which we knew would be at 8. We set out with a fresh wind on our starboard quarter, and for some time spanked along at a great rate, never dreaming of danger, for indeed we saw not the slightest reason to apprehend it. All at once we were taken aback by a breeze from over Helseggen. This was most unusual, something that had never happened to us before, and I began to feel a little uneasy without exactly knowing why. We put the boat on the wind, but could make no headway at all for the eddies, and I was upon the point of proposing to return to the anchorage when, looking astern, we saw the whole horizon covered with a singular copper-coloured cloud that rose with a most amazing velocity. In the meantime, the breeze that had headed us off fell away, and we were dead becalmed, drifting about in every direction. This state of things, however, did not last long enough to give us time to think about it. In less than a minute, the storm was upon us. In less than two, the sky was entirely overcast, and what with this and the driving spray, it became suddenly so dark that we could not see each other in the smack. Such a hurricane as then blew, it is folly to attempt describing. The oldest seaman in Norway never experienced anything like it. We had let our sails go by the run before it cleverly took us, but at the first puff, both our masts went by the board as if they had been sawed off, the mainmast taking with it my youngest brother, who had lashed himself to it for safety. Our boat was the lightest feather of a thing that ever sat upon water. It had a complete flush deck with only a small hatch near the bow, and this hatch it had always been our custom to batten down when about to cross the Strum, by way of precaution against the chopping seas. But for this circumstance, we should have found it at once, for we lay entirely buried for some moments. How my elder brother escaped destruction, I cannot say, for I never had an opportunity of ascertaining. For my part, as soon as I had let the foresail run, I threw myself flat on deck with my feet against the narrow gunwale of the bow, and with my hands grasping a ring bolt near the foot of the foremast. It was mere instinct that prompted me to do this, which was undoubtedly the very best thing I could have done, for I was too much flurried to think. For some moments we were completely deluged, as I say, and all this time I held my breath and clung to the bolt. When I could stand it no longer, I raised myself upon my knees, still keeping hold with my hands, and thus got my head clear. Presently our little boat gave herself a shake, just as a dog does coming in out of the water, and thus rid herself in some measure of the seas. I was now trying to get the better of the stupor that had come over me, and to collect my senses, so as to see what was to be done, when I felt somebody grasp my arm. It was my elder brother, and my heart leaped for joy, for I had made sure that he was overboard. But the next moment all this joy was turned into horror, for he put his mouth close to my ear and screamed out the word, Moskostrom. No one will ever know what my feelings were at that moment. I shook from head to foot as if I had the most violent fit of the ague. I knew what he meant by that one word well enough. I knew what he wished to make me understand. With the wind that now drove us on, we were bound for the whirl of the Strum, and nothing could save us. You perceive that in crossing the Strum channel, we always went a long way up above the whirl, even in the calmest weather, and then we had to wait and watch carefully for the slack. But now we were driving right upon the pool itself, and in such a hurricane as this. To be sure, I thought, we shall get there just about the slack. There is some little hope in that. But in the next moment I cursed myself for being so great a fool as to dream of hope at all. I knew very well that we were doomed, had we been 10 times a 90-gun ship. By this time the first fury of the tempest had spent itself, or perhaps we did not feel it so much, as we scudded before it, but at all events the seas, which at first had been kept down by the wind, and lay flat and frothing, now got up into absolute mountains. A singular change, too, had come over the heavens. Around in every direction it was still as black as pitch, but nearly overhead there burst out all at once a circular rift of clear sky, as clear as I ever saw, and of a deep bright blue, and through it there blazed forth the full moon with a lustre that I have never before knew her to wear. She lit up everything about us with the greatest distinctness, but oh God, what a scene it was to light up! I now made one or two attempts to speak to my brother, but in some manner which I could not understand. The din had so increased that I could not make him hear a single word, although I screamed at the top of my voice in his ear. Presently he shook his head, looking as pale as death, and held up one of his fingers as if to say, Listen. At first I could not make out what he meant, but soon a hideous thought flashed upon me. I dragged my watch from its fob. It was not going. I glanced at its face by the moonlight, and then burst into tears as I flung it far away into the ocean. It had run down at 7 o'clock. We were behind the time of the slack, and the whirl of the strum was in full fury. When a boat is well built, properly trimmed,
because they didn't know what time it was, they're actually in the middle of the storm, of the whirlpool. Now we're going to read the beginning of the story, but we'll just read it. Because what that should have meant is that the person that's telling the story should be dead. So what you just heard is the basics of how he got into a circumstance that he then got out of. So here's what I'd like to do. I'll just ask if anybody would like to start off reading. Anybody want to do that? At the beginning of the story, from we had now reached the summit. Or else I can start if you want, and then I'll just so we, unless somebody wishes to like to. You'll read? Okay, fine.
We had now reached the summit of
Maybe
the
you should come up so people, I think that's how this
this
works,
Right.
right? With the camera. Yeah.
We had now reached the summit of the loftiest crag. For some minutes, the old man seemed too much exhausted to speak. Not long ago, said he at length, and I could have guided you on this route as well as the youngest of my sons, but about 3 years past, there happened to me an event such as never happened before to mortal man, or at least such as no man ever survived to tell of. And the 6 hours of deadly terror which I then endured have broken me up, body and soul. You suppose me a very old man, but I am not. It took less than a single day to change these hairs from a jetty black to white, to weaken my limbs, and to unstring my nerves, so that I tremble at the least exertion, and am frightened at a shadow. Do you know I can scarcely look over this little cliff without getting giddy? The little cliff upon whose edge he had so carelessly thrown himself down to rest that the weightier portion of his body hung over it, while he was only kept from falling by the tenure of his elbow on its extreme and slippery edge. This little cliff arose a sheer unobstructed precipice of black shining rock, some 15 or 1600 feet from the world of crags beneath us. Nothing would have tempted me to within half a dozen yards of its brink. In truth, so deeply was I excited by the perilous position of my companion that I fell at full length upon the ground, clung to the shrubs around me, and dared not even glance upward at the sky, while I struggled in vain to divest myself of the idea that the very foundations of the mountain were in danger from the fury of the winds. It was long before I could reason myself into sufficient courage to sit up and look out into the distance. You must get over these fancies, said the guide, for I have brought you here that you might have the best possible view of the scene of that event I mentioned, and to tell you the whole story with the spot just under your eye.
Okay, stop there. Okay, so what's our scene? What are we, the opening shot, so to speak, the establishment shot, as they say in film. Where are we and what is happening? It's not just a quiz, I'm just asking. I'm going to be people have an image of what this is.
We're at the top of a cliff.
Right, which is on top of a group of mountains. We're on a mountain on top of mountains. So you've climbed to some very high distance, but then above that, there's another mountain, and they're on top of that. There's two people, and one of them is sitting over the edge and is talking to the other one who's too scared to go look over the edge, and is so scared because of where he is and because of the conditions that he is lying flat on the ground, basically grasping onto the grass. Okay? That's the setting. And the person who's leaning over and looking into the sea is saying that he has been broken by this and that he has been aged in a day, and that he can scarcely look over this thing, which the other person is basically imagining largely from what he's telling him and the general awesomeness of the scene. That's about right, I think. Right. Anybody add anything else in terms of what they think about what we're looking at here?
I just think it's interesting that the old man says that he trembles at the least exertion, but it seems like it's the narrator who's doing most of the trembling.
Right.
Something.
Okay. So that's good. Anybody else want to read? Pick it up.
I'll read.
You're ready.
You must get over these fancies, said the guide, for I have brought you here that you might have the best possible view of the scene of that event I mentioned, and to tell you the whole story with the spot just under your eye. We are now, he continued, in that particularizing manner which distinguished him, we are now close upon the Norwegian coast, in the 68th degree of latitude, in the great province of Nordland, and in the dreary district of Lofoten, the mountain upon whose top we sit is Helseggen, the cloudy. Now raise yourself up a little higher. Hold on to the grass if you feel giddy. So, and look out. Beyond the belt of vapor beneath us, into the sea. I looked dizzily, and beheld a wide expanse of ocean, whose waters were so inky a hue as to bring at once to my mind the Nubian geographer's account of the Mare Tenebrarum.
You mean the Sea of Shadows.
A panorama more deplorably desolate no human imagination can conceive. To the right and left, as far as the eye could reach, there lay outstretched, like ramparts of the world, lines of horridly black and beetling cliff, whose character of gloom was but the more forcibly illustrated by the surf which reared high up against its white and ghastly crest, howling and shrieking forever. Just opposite the promontory upon whose apex we were placed, and at a distance of some 5 or 6 miles out at sea, there was visible a small bleak-looking island, or more properly, its position was discernible through the wilderness of surge in which it was enveloped. About 2 miles nearer the land arose another of smaller size, hideously craggy and barren, and encompassed at various intervals by a cluster of dark rocks.
Okay, just stop for a minute. Here's what we're going to do, and I think that thank you to state it for a minute. Yeah, don't say it yet. What I want to do. So we've heard now we don't have the name of the Nubian Black African geographer who is writing about the Sea of Shadows. There's no name given, but that's one description that he's reminded of. He's not saying that the geographer was describing this place, but he's seeing a place that is hard to comprehend, basically. It's running beyond his comprehension. Now, what we're going to do is, rather than read straight through to the next section, which is a description of the storm and how the storm alters. Do this for me. Go to here. Okay. Yeah, right. Which these ships. Good.
We had now been about 10 minutes upon the top of Helseggen, to which we had ascended from the interior of Lofoden, so that we had caught no glimpse of the sea until it had burst upon us from the summit. As the old man spoke, I became aware of a loud and gradually increasing sound, like the moaning of a vast herd of buffaloes upon an American prairie. And at the same moment, I perceived that what seamen term the chopping character of the ocean beneath us was rapidly changing into a current which set to the eastward. Even while I gazed, this current acquired a monstrous velocity. Each moment added to its speed, to its headlong impetuosity. In 5 minutes, the whole sea, as far as Vurrgh, was lashed into ungovernable fury. But it was between Moscow and the coast that the main uproar held its sway. Here the vast bed of the waters, seamed and scarred into 1,000 conflicting channels, burst suddenly into frenzied convulsion, heaving, boiling, hissing, gyrating in gigantic and innumerable vortices, and all whirling and plunging onto the eastward with a rapidity which water never elsewhere assumes except in precipitous descents. In a few minutes more, there came over the scene another radical alteration. The general surface grew somewhat more smooth, and the whirlpools, one by one, disappeared, while prodigious streaks of foam became apparent where none had been seen before. These streaks, at length, spreading out to a great distance and entering into combination, took unto themselves the gyratory motion of the subsidized vortices, and seemed to form the germ of another more vast. Suddenly, very suddenly, this assumed a distinct and definite existence. In a circle of more than a 6 mile in diameter, the edge of the whirl was represented by a broad belt of gleaming spray, but no particle of this slipped into the mouth of the terrific funnel, whose interior, as far as the eye could fathom it, was a smooth, shining, and jet-black wall of water, inclined to the horizon at an angle of some 45 degrees, speeding dizzily round and round with a swaying and sweltering motion, and sending forth to the winds an appalling voice, half shriek, half roar, such as not even the mighty cataract of Niagara ever lifts up in its agony to heaven.
Okay, let's stop for a minute. So here's what I want people to do here, or want us to make sure, that we have a visualization of what he's doing, what he's saying. Can somebody state, anybody, just given your idea of what's the physical, what's being physically represented here? You know, he's given us an image. What is it? It's got a lot of pieces to it.
It's a monstrous storm.
Right, but it starts a certain way, right? He says this idea, you hear this sound like buffalo, and then there's a chopping character of the ocean, so he's seeing what? Waves, little waves inside of it.
Yeah, waves in rapid succession.
Right. And then what happens? It says it changes into a current which set to the eastward. Okay, there's a direction to it. And then it starts moving a lot faster. And then it says the whole sea is lashed into fury. but then between the coast and this island, that's where most of the action is. And then what does he say here about the water? Seems to be a very particular description.
It burst suddenly into frenzied convulsion, heaving, boiling, hissing, gyrating in gigantic and innumerable vortices.
So what is that? What's that mean? What's happening?
It's like multiple whirlpools.
A whole lot of them. He says
Yeah.
they're innumerable. You can't even count them. So they're all going in this one direction, which is not kind of
It's
important.
nuts.
Right? Yeah. And he says moving really fast, and then it changes again. Right? So what's he say happens in the next paragraph? What's the new thing that happens?
Seem to coalesce.
Right, kind of like a slime mold.
Yeah.
There are all these different
Come
individual
together and
things,
become
right?
one giant one.
And it becomes a giant thing. And he says, and all of the foam all intersects, and none of it falls into the funnel. Right? These streaks spreading out to a great distance, entering into combination, took unto themselves the gyratory motion of the subsided vortices. So there's one motion of all of the motion in a circle of more than a mile. So it's a mile across.
So that image is of the foam of a small whirlpool getting like distended across the arc of the larger whirlpool.
Well, a small foam of like 1,000
Right.
innumerable whirlpools.
Right, but like yeah.
Yeah, right. See, so you got to understand what is he seeing? Right. What is this guy seeing? Which the other guys are sitting on the side of the mountain, right? All right. And he's saying, and he's comparing it to Niagara Falls and says, you never hear anything like this at Niagara Falls. Who's been to Niagara Falls? Here. You've been there. Okay. So you know how loud that can be. You've been to the Canadian side as well as you got to go to the Canadian side because that's like the New York side is like nothing compared to the Canadian side. That's exciting. So he's saying it's way louder than that. That's the main point. So, I mean, it's basically, it's supposed to be an image unlike anything that you can imagine. That's what he's trying to show. He's trying to illustrate an image of the unimaginable. That's what Poe's doing here. Okay, so just read for me the beginning of this next part, and then I'm going to ask somebody else to read.
Sure. The mountain trembled to its very base, and the rock rocked. I threw myself upon my face and clung to the scant herbage in an excess of nervous agitation. This, said I at length to the old man, this can be nothing else than the great whirlpool of the maelstrom. So it is sometimes termed, said he. We Norwegians call it the Moscow-strom, from the island of Moscow in the Midway.
Okay. Now, the next section of this is about how the descriptions of this are nothing like what it is. So I'd like somebody else to read.
Sure, I can read.
Sure.
The ordinary accounts of this vortex had by no means prepared me for what I saw. That of Jonas Ramos, which is perhaps the most circumstantial of any, cannot impart the faintest conception either of the magnificence or of the horror of the scene, or of the wild, bewildering sense of the novel which confounds the beholder. I am not sure from what point of view the writer in question surveyed it, nor at what time, but it could neither have been from the summit of Helseggen, nor during a storm. There are some passages of his description, nevertheless, which may be quoted for their details, although their effect is exceedingly feeble in conveying an impression of the spectacle. Between Lofoden and Moscow, he says, the depth of the water is between 36 and 40 fathoms, But on the other side, toward Ver, this depth decreases so as not to afford a convenient passage for a vessel, without the risk of splitting on the rocks, which happens even in the calmest weather. When it is flood, the stream runs up the country between Lofoden and Moscow with a boisterous rapidity. But the roar of its impetuous ebb to the sea is scarce equaled by the loudest and most dreadful cataracts, the noise being heard several leagues off, and the vortices or pits are of such an extent and depth that if a ship comes within its attraction, it is inevitably absorbed and carried down to the bottom, and there beat to pieces against the rocks. And when the water relaxes, the fragments thereof are thrown up again. But these intervals of tranquility are only at the turn of the ebb, and flood, and in calm weather, and last but a quarter of an hour, its violence gradually returning. When the stream is most boisterous and its fury heightened by a storm, it is dangerous to come within a Norway mile of it. Boats, yachts, and ships have been carried away by not guarding against it before they were within its reach. It likewise happens frequently that whales come too near the stream and are overpowered by its violence. And then it is impossible to describe their howlings and bellowings in their fruitless struggles to disengage themselves. A bear once, attempting to swim from Lofoden to Moscow, was caught by the stream and borne down, while he roared terribly, so as to be heard on shore. Large stalks of firs and pine trees, after being absorbed by the current, rise again, broken and torn, to such a degree as if bristles grew upon them. This plainly shows the bottom to consist of craggy rocks, among which they are whirled to and fro. This stream is regulated by the flux and reflux of the sea, it being constantly high and low water every 6 hours. In the year 1645, early in the morning of Sexagesima Sunday, it raged with such noise and impetuosity that the very stones of the houses on the coast fell to the ground.
Now, before you proceed, he's now going to challenge what he just quoted, just so people know what's going to happen here. Go ahead.
In regard to the depth of the water, I could not see how this could have been ascertained at all in the immediate vicinity of the vortex. The 40 fathoms must have reference only to portions of the channel close upon the shore either of Moscow or Lofoden. The depth in the center of the Moscow Strom must be immeasurably greater, and no better proof of this fact is necessary than can be obtained from even the sidelong glance into the abyss of the whirl, which may be had from the highest crag of Helseggen. Looking down from this pinnacle upon the howling Phlegethon below, I could not help smiling at the simplicity with which the honest Jonas Ramos records, as a matter difficult of belief, the anecdotes of the whales and the bears. For it appeared to me, in fact, a self-evident thing that the largest ship of the line in existence, coming within the influence of that deadly attraction, could resist it as little as a feather the hurricane, and must disappear bodily and at once.
Okay, so let's just take this paragraph off. So what's he saying here about the description that was read earlier?
He can't see how anybody could have come to the that conclusion.
Right. That the conclusions of the authority can't be right. And why does he say he knows that?
Just because he's viewing it from
Right.
like
From
his
above.
aerial view. Yeah.
Right. He has an aerial view of it. And he said, if you've ever been up here, then you'd know that couldn't be true. You couldn't be able to estimate the depth that way because it says it, right? Even the sidelong glance into the abyss of the world, because that's what he's doing. He's not actually standing up looking at it. He's looking at it from the side over here. He's doing one of those. So I can tell that I can tell what was said was not true. Anything else? Oh, and he's also saying that the stories about the whales and the bears can't be true. Right. that clear to everybody? How come why can't those stories be true?
Because it's like, it doesn't actually make sense. Like, you wouldn't actually hear a bear.
Because it would happen
It would
too
be
fast.
loud.
Well, yeah, and it would be too loud.
It would be too loud and it would happen too fast, both. Because he says, the largest ship of the line in existence coming within the influence of that deadly attraction could resist it as little as a feather, the hurricane, and must disappear bodily and at once. It doesn't mean that something might not scream, but between the sound and, the storm itself and the rapidity, how would you know that?
It's like a black hole.
Okay, so why don't you continue the next paragraph?
The attempts to account for the phenomenon, some of which I remember seemed to me sufficiently plausible in perusal, now wore a very different and unsatisfactory aspect. The idea generally received is that this, as well as 3 smaller vortices among the Faroe Islands, have no other cause than the collision of waves rising and falling at flux and reflux against a ridge of rocks and shelves, which confines the water so that it precipitates itself like a cataract. And thus, the higher the flood rises, the deeper must the fall be, and the natural result of all is a whirlpool or vortex, the prodigious suction of which is sufficiently known by lesser experiments. These are the words of the Encyclopedia Britannica. Kircher and others imagine that in the center of the channel of the maelstrom is an abyss penetrating the globe, and issuing in some very remote part, the Gulf of Bothnia being somewhat decidedly named in one instance. This opinion, idle in itself, was the one to which, as I gazed, my imagination most readily assented, and mentioning it to the guide, I was rather surprised to hear him say that although it was the view almost universally entertained of the subject by the Norwegians, it nevertheless was not his own. As to the former notion, he confessed his inability to comprehend it. And here I agreed with him. For however conclusive on paper, it becomes altogether unintelligible and even absurd amid the thunder of the abyss.
Okay, so kind of, let's use the first slide. We're going to stop here for a minute. We're going to come back to the story in a minute. There's a slide I want to show people, and I don't know if that's able to be made any larger. Is that possible? Make a bigger image. That's good enough.
You should be able to make it larger on this.
Yeah. Okay. And we're going to say something there. There's a whole idea or school of what's called economic modeling. And actually, I'm only show this for just for a minute, and then we're going to go to the subsequent vortex things. This is a function. It's called a triple curve function. It's made up of 3 hyperbolic curves. Now, that's a fancy name for saying vortex. And let's go to the next one, actually. Now, next slide. Okay, now, in a cylinder, you have a form of motion which is uniform, like a sine wave. Can you make that any bigger? Is that possible? Because this is all very brief. I'm not doing this to concentrate on the images. I'm just trying to put the images in to provoke some.
I can just re-edit the slide.
It's all right. Don't worry about it. That's because it's fine. We don't need it for a lot of time.
Okay.
Well, everybody knows what a sine wave is, right? It means it's like a wave of a constant amplitude, right? Height. Whereas if you're in a conic shape, like in a vortex, then the amplitude of the wave grows. Okay, let's go to the next one. Okay, so this is what I want to show. So when you're talking about a whirlpool, now remember, this would not be flat like you're seeing on the screen. It would be rotating. But what is it made up of? It's made up of it's like an envelope, a combination of a series of cones I'm doing this now geometrically because I'm trying to show something about volume and the growth of volume. We use these, or have used these, for economic analysis. And there is a way that you can use this for economic analysis, which will become a subject not for tonight, but I'm showing it here because of what we're, if we look, for example, at any phase of the development of an economy where the economy is expanding, then you can speak about the growth. Go back one for me. Go back one slide. Yeah, so that where you see this curve, an Archimedean curve in this case, this would represent, this cut of the cone would represent a higher volume. It's larger, it's fatter than the volume, let's say, cut here. And we'll just, for purposes, because again, these are, we're using representations of something that is not actually representable in this form. So let's go back on and now to the envelope. And let's go to the next one. Okay, so you have one after this also?
Yeah.
Go to that one. No, go, okay, come back. All right, so again, this is an envelope. So if you imagine this as though it's three-dimensional, not two-dimensional. It's a whirlpool, and you're seeing a set of volumes. And what's happening is that the volumes increase, and the motion, if you think about this as something moving, you're going to get forms of motion that are, as they say, nonlinear. Ways in which you suddenly begin to move, which are not immediately forecastable by people within that. That's going to become important for the story in a minute. This is significant because if you look at our society today, the United States today, many people who try to do economic modeling are trying to do forecasting without taking into account the nature of the dynamic of an economy. Because in a dynamic economy, you can think that something is going to happen, but unless you take into account what the actual environment is, the envelope is, of the action of that economy, if you try to isolate it by itself, you're going to come up with all kinds of false conclusions. It doesn't mean that the thing can't be forecasted. It means that you have to be able to look at it from outside of any one of the particular slices or conics that your particular frame of reference will have to define. As soon as you start plugging in numbers, number values, you're going to end up with a scalar. And it's going to, in some fashion, either linearize, or it's going to give you only a snapshot approximation of a process that is actually moving, even as you talk about it, in a qualitatively different way. And so one of the problems of what happened to the sailors is that they were operating with a scalar, an external scalar, the watch. What he didn't consider is that the watch had stopped. It didn't occur to him that the watch had stopped. So actually, he had no idea what time was. The time that was actually functioning was completely different. So the scalar they were using, in other words, he wasn't using some physical correlate. He wasn't reading the signs, though normally they would do that, right? I mean, and they were doing that, but they had, in this instance, relied on the idea that the watch is going to tell us exactly what time we got to start back, but the watch didn't tell them. So what's relevant here is that if the moment that you have, even by accident, a scalar unit of measurement that tries to define a physical process, you have a problem. It will be incommensurate with what it is you are evaluating, how you're thinking, how you're perceiving what's going on. It will not match. Be operating in a completely different realm. Okay. I don't think we'll use the other ones. I want to go back to the story. So what we know now is that he's in the middle with his brother of the maelstrom, of the storm. And what I want to do here is, and that he should not have survived. But he did. So what we're going to do here is try to see what allowed him to survive. And I'm not going to try, I want to not go through all of the story. I want to move here. So I'm going to read a paragraph and then ask people to read again. So he's in the middle with his brother. It says, I'm going to pick up at the bottom of that page, the last one we were on. Could not have been more than 2 minutes afterward until we suddenly felt the waves subside and were enveloped in foam. The boat made a sharp turn, half turned to larboard, and then shot off in its new direction like a thunderbolt. At the same moment, the roaring noise of the water was completely drowned in a kind of shrill shriek, such as the sound you might imagine given out by the waste pipes of many thousand steam vessels. So what's happening is they're going into it. So now I'm going to go to the top of the next page, and this is the one paragraph I want to read, and then ask if people read again. He said this: "It may look like boasting, but what I tell you is truth. I began to reflect how magnificent a thing it was to die in such a manner, and how foolish it was in me to think of so paltry a consideration as my own individual life, in view of so wonderful a manifestation of God's power. I do believe that I blushed with shame when this idea crossed my mind. After a little while, I began possessed with the keenest curiosity about the world itself. I positively felt a wish to explore its depths, even at the sacrifice I was going to make. And my principal grief was that I should never be able to tell my old companions on shore about the mysteries I should see. These, no doubt, were singular fancies to occupy a man's mind in such extremity, and I have often thought since that the revolutions of the boat around the pool might have rendered me a little lightheaded." So now, that's obviously an interesting paragraph. I'm not going to stop to try to interpret it. He said what he said. Whether we agree with it or not, that's what he said. There was another circumstance which tended to restore my self-possession, and this was the cessation of the wind, which could not reach us in our present situation. For as you saw yourself, the belt of the surf is considerably lower than the general bed of the ocean, and this latter now towered above us, a high, black, mountainous ridge. So what he's saying is that they are on the side of the whirlpool. So the whirlpool is going around like this, and the boat is like this. I think at some point, maybe it was earlier or maybe it's later, he says that the boat is traveling at a 45-degree angle. Okay, and so they're going around the whirlpool, and he's in the boat, and they're able to sort of, well, it's not clear what they can do actually in this little piece, but they are. That's what he's seeing. How often we made the circuit of the belt, it is impossible to say. We careered round and round for perhaps an hour, flying rather than floating, getting gradually more and more into the middle of the surge, and then nearer and nearer to its horrible inner edge. All this time, I had never let go of the ring bolt. My brother was at the stern, holding onto a small empty water cask, which had been securely lashed under the coop of the counter, and was the only thing on deck that had not been swept overboard when the gale first took us. As we approached the brink of the pit, he let go his hold upon this and made for the ring, from which, in the agony of his terror, he endeavored to force my hands. So the brother had the water cask, which was lashed down, and he's at a ring bolt. And so now what's happening is his brother is trying to force his hands, as it was not large enough to afford us both a secure grasp. So he's saying he's trying to pull his brother off, and he's on the ring pole. He says, "I never felt deeper grief than when I saw him attempt this act, although I knew he was a madman when he did it, a raving maniac through sheer fright. I did not care, however, to contest the point with him. I knew it could make no difference whether each of us held on at all. So I let him have the boat and went astern to the cask. This there was no difficulty in doing, for the smack flew round steadily enough and upon an even keel, only swaying to and fro with the immense sweeps and swelters of the whirl. Scarcely had I secured myself in my new position when we gave a wild lurch to the starboard and rushed headlong into the abyss. Okay, so I was wrong. I was saying we were already in it. We didn't go. They were at the edge, and then they went in. Okay. I muttered a hurried prayer to God and thought all was over. So I'm going to stop there. Who would like to read now? Somebody else that has it. Sure, please.
As I felt the sickening sweep of the descent, I had instinctively tightened my hold upon the barrel and closed my eyes. For some seconds, I dared not open them. While I expected instant destruction and wondered that I was not already in my death struggles with the water. But moment after moment elapsed. I still lived. The sense of falling had ceased, and the motion of the vessel seemed much as it had been before, while in the belt of foam, with the exception that she now lay more along. I took courage and looked once again upon the scene. Never shall I forget the sensations of awe, horror, and admiration with which I gazed about me. The boat appeared to be hanging, as if by magic, midway down upon the interior surface of a funnel vast in circumference, prodigious in depth, and whose perfectly smooth sides might have been mistaken for ebony. But for the bewildering rapidity with which they spun around, and for the gleaming and ghastly radiance they shot forth, as the rays of the full moon, from that circular rift amid the clouds, which I have already described, streamed in a flood of golden glory against the black walls, and far away down into the innermost recesses of the abyss. At first, I was too much confused to observe anything accurately. The general burst of terrific grandeur was all that I beheld. When I recovered myself a little, however, my gaze fell instinctively downward. In this direction I was able to obtain an unobstructed view, from the manner in which the smack hung on the inclined surface of the pool. She was quite upon an even keel. That is to say, her deck lay in a plane parallel with that of the water, but this latter sloped at an angle of more than 45 degrees, so that we seemed to be lying upon our beam ends. I could not help observing, nevertheless, that I had scarcely more difficulty in maintaining my hold and footing in the situation than if we had been upon a dead level, and this, I suppose, was owing to the speed at which we revolved. The rays of the moon seemed to search the very bottom of a profound gulf, but still I could make out nothing distinctly, on account of the thick mist in which everything there was enveloped, and over which there hung a magnificent rainbow, like that narrow and tottering bridge between Mussulmen, say, is the only pathway between time and eternity. This mist or spray was no doubt occasioned by the clashing of the great walls of the funnel, as they all met together at the bottom. But the yell that went up to the heavens from out of the mist, I dare not attempt to describe. Our first slide into the abyss itself, from the belt of foam above, had carried us a great distance down the slope, but our farther descent was by no means proportionate. Round and round we swept, not with any uniform movement, but in dizzying swings and jerks that sent us sometimes only a few hundred yards, sometimes nearly the complete circuit of the world. Our progress downward at each revolution was slow but very perceptible. Looking about me, upon the wide waste of liquid ebony on which we were thus borne, I perceived that our boat was not the only object in the embrace of the world. Both above and below us were visible fragments of vessels, large masses of building timber and trunks of trees, with many smaller articles such as pieces of house furniture, broken boxes, barrels, and staves. I have already described the unnatural curiosity which had taken the place of my original terrors. It appeared to grow upon me as I drew nearer and nearer to my dreadful doom. I now began to watch, with a strange interest, the numerous things that floated in our company. I must have been delirious, for I even sought amusement in speculating upon the relative velocities of their several descents towards the foam below. This fir tree, I found myself at one time saying, will certainly be the next thing that takes the awful plunge and disappears. and then I was disappointed to find that the wreck of a Dutch merchant ship overtook it and went down before. At length, after making several guesses of this nature, and being deceived in all, this fact, the fact of my invariable miscalculation, set me upon a train of reflection that made my limbs again tremble, and my heart beat heavily once more. It was not a new terror that thus affected me, but the dawn of a more exciting hope. This hope arose partly from memory, and partly from present observation. I called to mind the great variety of buoyant matter that strewed the coast of Lofoten, having been absorbed and then thrown forth by the Moscow Strom. By far the greater number of the articles were shattered in the most extraordinary way, so chafed and roughened as to have the appearance of being stuck full of splinters. But then I distinctly recollected that there were some of them which were not disfigured at all. Now I could not account for this difference except by supposing that the roughened fragments were the only ones which had been completely absorbed, that the others had entered the world at so late a period of the tide, or for some reason had descended so slowly after entering, that they did not reach the bottom before the turn of the flood came, or of the ebb, as the case might be. I conceived it possible, in either instance, that they might just be whirled up again to the level of the ocean, without undergoing the fate of those which had been drawn in more early, or absorbed more rapidly. I made, also, 3 important observations. The first was that, as a general rule, the larger the bodies were, the more rapid their descent. The second, that between 2 masses of equal extent, the one spherical and the other of any other shape, the superiority in speed of descent was with the sphere. The third, that between 2 masses of equal size, the one cylindrical and the other of any other shape, the cylinder was absorbed the more slowly. Since my escape, I have had several conversations on this subject with an old schoolmaster of the district, and it was from him that I learned the use of the words cylinder and sphere. He explained to me, although I have forgotten the explanation, how what I observed was, in fact, the natural consequence of the forms of the floating fragments, and showed me how it happened that a cylinder swimming in a vortex offered more resistance to its suction, and was drawn in with greater difficulty than an equally bulky body of any form whatever. There was one startling circumstance, which went a great way in enforcing these observations, and rendering me anxious to turn them to account. And this was that, at every revolution we passed something like a barrel, or else the yard or the mast of a vessel, while many of these things which had been on our level when I first opened my eyes upon the wonders of the whirlpool were now high up above us, and seemed to have moved but little from their original station. I no longer hesitated what to do. I resolved to lash myself securely to the water cask upon which I now held, to cut it loose from the counter, and to throw myself with it into the water. I attracted my brother's attention by signs, pointing to the floating barrels that came near us, and did everything in my power to make him understand what I was about to do. I thought at length that he comprehended my design, but, whether this was the case or not, he shook his head despairingly, and refused to move from his station by the ring-bolt. It was impossible to reach him. The emergency admitted of no delay, and so, with a bitter struggle, I resigned him to his fate, fastened myself to the cask by means of the lashings which secured it to the counter, and precipitated myself with it into the sea, without another moment's hesitation. The result was precisely what I had hoped it would be. As it is myself who now tell you this tale, as you see that I did escape, and as you are already in possession of the mode in which this escape was effected, and must therefore anticipate all that I have farther to say, I will bring my story quickly to conclusion. It might have been an hour, or thereabout, after my quitting the smack, when, having descended to a vast distance beneath me, it made 3 or 4 wild gyrations in rapid succession, and bearing my loved brother with it, plunged headlong at once and forever into the chaos of foam below. The barrel to which I was attached sunk very little farther than half the distance between the bottom of the gulf and the spot at which I leaped overboard, before a great change took place in the character of the whirlpool. The slope of the sides of the vast funnel became momently less and less steep. The gyrations of the whirl grew, gradually, less and less violent. By degrees, the froth and the rainbow disappeared, and the bottom of the gulf seemed slowly to uprise. The sky was clear, the winds had gone down, and the full moon was setting radiantly in the west, when I found myself on the surface of the ocean, in full view of the shores of Lofoden, and above the spot where the pool of the Moscow Strom had been. It was the hour of the slack, but the sea still heaved in mountainous waves from the effects of the hurricane. I was borne violently into the channel of the Strom, and in a few minutes was hurried down the coast into the grounds of the fishermen. A boat picked me up, exhausted from fatigue, and now that the danger was removed, speechless from the memory of its horror. Those who drew me on board were my old mates and daily companions, but they knew me no more than they would have known a traveler from the spirit land. My hair, which had been raven black the day before, was as white as you see it now. They say too that the whole expression of my countenance had changed. I told them my story. They did not believe it. I now tell it to you, and I can scarcely expect you to put more faith in it than the merry fishermen of Lofoden.
So, any thoughts? He got an explanation about what happened, but he doesn't remember it. He didn't know what a cylinder, sphere, and he doesn't remember what the schoolmaster told him. But he knows how it works. I guess I'll say just a couple things, but actually, I'm actually interested. I mean, do any people have any particular thoughts just about what this actually means? And I don't mean it's secret what it means. It's sort of because he says, you know, I told the people that picked me up what happened. They said, nah, that didn't happen. I'm telling you, you probably don't believe it.
I mean, at the risk of sounding reductive, I think it's just about honestly trying to investigate and examine life. Like, it's what it seems like to me. Like, the more earnestly and individualized one's observation, experience, apprehension, and communication of that experience is with respect to their own life, which is only theirs and nobody else's, and is tumultuous, the less they can expect somebody else to understand it. And so I think that this is kind of about, I mean, there's so many things I was thinking throughout it, and it reminded me of so many other, whether music or literature things or whatever, but how language is futile sometimes. The narrative is never the thing itself. And so the one universal thing, it kind of is uncertainty and an abject awareness of that uncertainty and the mutual recognition of it and interest in delving deeper, I think. Or, without acknowledging that intrinsic uncertainty, you're kind of, I don't know. But anyway, yeah, I'm kind of rambling now, but those were some of my thoughts.
But that's fine. And the whole point is I just want to know what people are thinking. There isn't anything right or wrong about thinking any of this. I think, what did he do? No,
Discovered how to save himself.
Right. Okay.
I mean, he discovered how things were moving around him.
I think he was just trying to survive, and coincidentally, he discovered that was the way. Yeah.
Right, but think about it. His brother was trying to survive too.
Yeah.
Right,
I
but it
think-
was.
Brother was trying to kill him.
Yeah.
Did you say that?
I think what this is describing is what LaRouche would call a physical principle, and that's what he discovered.
Yeah, he was looking at the sides of the things, and notice what he said. He said, I was trying to guess which one of these things was going to break next, and every time I was wrong.
So it's like you said earlier, whether you agree or don't agree with his assessment of a certain kind of acceptance of his faith.
Right.
Whether you agree with it or not, that was a precondition for the discovery that he made.
And well, certainly the way he described it, he said, look, I found myself, wow, this is a hell of a way to die, Now, okay, now that's, I'm being funny, but what I'm trying to say is he had to decide that he was going to not reconcile himself precisely, although that's one way you could think about it. But the better word is not reconciliation, but atonement. You're at one with the process. You're in something. You decide that you're going to actually understand it. Think about the idea of atonement as also like the word tuning, to be in tune with.
And it's sort of like freeing your mind, right?
Yeah, his brother's mind was completely, and so was he. I mean, he was terrified.
But it was counterintuitive because you would sort of think, well, if you hold on to the biggest and strongest thing, then you have a better chance of surviving than jumping into the middle of the water.
Well, yeah, that's certainly what, I mean, I'm sure his brother thought he was crazy when he jumped in the water.
Yeah, and he even said that he was starting to accept death, and he was starting to see just how beautiful it was. Like, he wouldn't have died in any other way.
Mhm.
And I feel like because of that, he was able to start making those observations. Like, he was like, well, if I'm going to die anyway, I may as well look at what I'm seeing. Like, I may as well start observing. And it was like, if it had gone any other way, he probably wouldn't have survived. If he had just been like, oh no, I'm just gonna die here, then he would have died.
I feel like it was a good example of what happens when you surrender to a situation
Mhm.
versus like resisting it. So his brother was on the side of resistance, and
Mhm.
it just completely went not in his favor as a result. But when he finally surrendered, it gave him like the freedom of mind to just like look around him, and then, like you said, like he was actually able to save himself as a result.
Yeah.
Of that.
I mean, it's sort of interesting, right, to think about, well, interesting. I think it's interesting, but there are all sorts of religious beliefs, right? But the one thing that's uniform that they all address is the idea of being. They all deal with that. So you're in a situation where, I mean, the narrator, the original narrator, right, is overwhelmed just by being at the top of the mountain and looking over. And I mean, that can be, that's, you've probably seen, there's all sorts of stuff on the internet you can see about situations like that, like those people that, have the flying suits and they're flying around. Almost, I don't want to trivialize it, but I'm trying to say there is a majesty which is clearly greater than the human being, which is experienced. Okay, so what happens if, though, that is something that you decide to grasp, actually understand? Well, in one part, that really takes deciding that the way you think things are is not the way they are. We're discovering that that's the case. And that's what he's doing as he's going down. And he says, well, all of a sudden, hope started. Right? I began to hope. He says, because I'm seeing something here. And he said he's recalling other objects that he'd seen on the shore that had been broken up, but then some hadn't been. Then he's trying to figure out, and then he's looking up and he says, well, there's some stuff that's up. We're down here now. It's still up there. Well, what is that? So this discovery of a universal principle. See, it's not just the principle; it's got to be a universal principle, because he's in something which is a dynamic, moving, shrieking, howling process, in which he has no right. And when they pick him up, remember that he says, "I actually couldn't talk because once they picked me up, I realized what had happened." And he says, "I was speechless." So he wasn't communicating what he thought about what happened in the moments that he was picked up. This goes to this issue that you brought up before about words. It's a thing that Dante says actually also in his Commedia, the great poem, which is 100, actually it's 100 poems. It's 33 for the three of heaven, purgatory, and hell. And it's got one last poem, canto. And he speaks about, at the beginning and at the end, that he cannot tell you what he actually saw. That everything you're reading that he is saying is not what he actually saw. The whole poem is that. And he's trying to give you an idea of the process he went through, but he cannot tell you what he actually saw. He knows what it was, but he cannot say what it was.
Why?
Because the words don't allow it. It's like, if you talk to a real musician and ask them, well, what is your song about? They'll say, it's about the song. Because the song is the language. So I said what I wanted to say. That's why I wrote this. Don't ask me to tell you what it means. It means what it is. And that's not coy. That's actually
So
an accurate.
it's like I cannot tell you, or I don't want to tell you.
No, it can't be done. Or let me do a little bit differently. Here's a question I'll ask. Can you actually put an idea in someone else's head? You say no. Okay. Why?
Well, because everyone has a different perspective of whatever idea you're trying to convey. No matter how, or you try to communicate that idea to someone, they won't see it in the exact same way that you see it.
All right. Anybody else? I mean, maybe other people think something different. What do you think?
I say possibly through the power of suggestion, you can give someone an idea that maybe they hadn't previously thought of, but they do have to accept it, I think, in order to believe that it's their own idea, which you cannot impact that.
Right. So your point is that you can influence someone to think in a certain way, but you cannot make them think that thing.
Unless they want to.
Unless they in fact want to.
Yeah.
You can say now you can induce a want, but you cannot induce the idea. That's what you seem to be saying. I'm just asking. But if somebody thinks something different, please. Or if you agree, what is that? What would that mean? See, there's a theologian by the name of Nicholas Acusis. If you're around us, you'll hear us mention him. And a lot of people talk about him and talk about how wonderful and ingenious he is. But Nicholas Acusis had this thing called negative theology. That's what he practiced. Now, here's what he says continually. Whatever you say about the nature of God is infinitely less than what God is. So however profound you think you're being, at the point you've said that's infinitely less than the thing you're describing. Well, now, what are the things that people would some people would then say, hey, well, cut out the middleman, why do the work? I mean, if anything I try to come up with is going to never reach the thing I'm striving to express, what's the point of trying? Now, I mean, he didn't think that, but I think this is one of the problems that people get into, because we have senses, and our sensorium is not what reality is. But how can we know reality except by means of, it seems, the senses? Well, principles. So, for example, he couldn't tell you how the vortex was composed, but he could tell you how he could escape. Now, he can't just do that by deciding it. He's got to do something which is physically consistent with the process. So he's got to recognize something about the action that's occurring of which he's a part. Right? He may not have been a willing part, but he is a part of it. Well, think about this one thing he also says when he makes this remark that the boat is going around at a 45-degree plus angle, but he can actually sort of move around on it. And he's saying, I think it's because of the speed at which the thing is traveling. Remember, we were talking last week about this issue of the Earth rotating at 1,000 miles an hour on its axis, and then rotating at 66,000 miles an hour around the sun, and then the solar system rotating at 1,000,000 miles an hour around the galaxy. Remember this thing we were talking about? But you don't, quote, feel any of that, right? So you're traveling at extraordinary speeds, which are actually compounded. And also the whole point is the galactic plane, you're traveling through a galactic plane and you're shifting above and below the actual plane of the stars in the galaxy. That's why you get more or less radiation at different points. I forget exactly. I think it's 62 million years. I think it is that it takes us to do one rotation. Because the galaxy's rotating. It's interesting to ask, what is it rotating around, by the way? So, and it's only one of what's now estimated to be 2 trillion galaxies that we can see. So we're part of that motion. Okay, now obviously we don't comprehend that motion, but we can apprehend something about that motion by means of something we call a principle. This is the issue of what we mean by intelligence work. See, there's all these things, of course, that, and if you're around, of course, obviously this is a political campaign. We're ready for office. There are particular policies, programs. We have, enemies or saying, let's go after this person to that person. But really, all of that is very ephemeral. It's very transitory. Okay? For those of us I'll take myself, I remember clearly when the Congress used to be a Congress, and the Congress did things like form a committee to investigate the assassinations of JFK and Martin Luther King, and how the church committee formed itself to deal with them. That's how we found out that the National Security Agency even existed. Its existence was denied. The American people didn't even know it existed. It came to a Senate investigation committee. This is 1975. Well, at that time, those issues were intense, and people were spending all their time parsing the issues, and they knew all the names, and Sam Ervin's people on his committee, and right? None of that means that much to people in this room, right? That's 45 years ago, 47 years ago, right? Almost 45 years ago. Does that mean that these things are not significant? Well, principle is really what's significant. What Poe is pointing to in the story, I think what's important about what he's given us here is a way to realize that real knowledge is different than formula or authority or terms, like cylinder and sphere. You have to know the action to know what those are. You can name these things. Naming is not wrong, it may be useful, but it is not the content or principle. And so here's this person who is living essentially on the mountaintop, has mastered the mountaintop, and can look into the whirlpool because he's been in the whirlpool and understands it, and can take someone else who's come to him. We don't really know why. We don't know how this actually happened, that these people walked up to the top of the mountain. Obviously, this person must have wanted to know something about this whirlpool, this maelstrom process. Well, actually, the whirlpool, because the storm is a little different, right? As he says. But to know that, you have to know the storm. So I just think it, in the politics that you should have, if you want to put it this way, in America or anyplace else, it's got to become like this. It's got to become something which allows people to divest themselves of lower order disagreements and disparities in order to talk about things like this and how that should inform what we think policy should be. I mean, how you know, there are ways you can do that. It's like talking about the question, the problem of war. Everybody can come up at some point with a justifiable reason to fight somebody. And the reasons will be justifiable. But then, invariably, something happens that you can't justify. Like you cannot justify why 5-year-old kids anywhere are losing their arms or legs in the middle of a war. You say, well, because they were in the way. Well, that doesn't justify that because you don't know what the potential of that child is. You don't know the significance of that child for humanity. Actually, you can't, actually. You can know that there can be a great significance. That's the whole point of it being potential. So if you have a process that must somehow converge upon or depend upon the eradication of large numbers of children, you know that can't be right. I don't care how justified some action that you took, which is a particular action in a particular circumstance. We may all agree with you, even, but what's the action you're going to take? What's it going to mean? Now we have Israel and Lebanon. They're heading towards Syria if they can get there. They're going to try to go to Egypt if they can. And they have the guys who put on the patches that say Greater Israel. So they're doing that thing that a lot of people don't know. Is that the Israeli people? No. But on the other hand, who killed Yitzhak Rabin? Rabin was a soldier. Rabin had done to the Palestinians exactly the kind of stuff that Netanyahu is doing. He did it in the Intifada. He did it in the 1980s. And he just said at a certain point, Arafat said something different, but Rabin just said, I'm just tired of killing people. So I'm going to die, and it's all going to end up being just like it was when I was killing all these people. We have to come to we got to have a conclusion to this. So they had the Oslo Accords. This is in the 90s, okay? And he shakes hands with Arafat, and he gets assassinated at a election rally. Let's remember, he's running, right, for Prime Minister of Israel. And he gets assassinated by one of the people who is a supporter of Netanyahu. Today it's denied, but that's what happened. It was in 1995. This will be the 30th anniversary of his assassination. Will be next year, next November 10th or something like that. 30 years ago. This was all reconciled 30 years ago. It was bad then. And like I said, Rabin had been the defense minister as well as the prime minister. He had killed Palestinians left and right. And he and Arafat decided, because they were old men that had been killing them for 30, 40 years, he said, let's stop it. And the Netanyahu that you're dealing with now came to power. He became the next prime minister. So the reality of what we're dealing with this, right? We cannot deal with these things by simply confronting them, though we should, right? In the terms that are given to us. So you take this meeting we're going to be doing next Saturday, Jose talked about it, and just want to say a word about this. The concept is all those people that are coming, whether Scott Ritter or this one, all these people are in one sense seeking sanctuary. See, because if you come to the LaRouche thing, that's as far out as you can go. Okay, that's the last island. You know, and because that's just where we lived. Yeah, we were pushed there, but that's where we lived. We don't care. We are going to fight for principle, despite the fact that people may not believe what we are saying, like this old man at the top of the mountain. Now, we will tell you, and we will also fight with you. We're not saying that we're better. It's that we've been through it. We've been through the maelstrom. We know it's real. We know it's nothing like what people say. And we know that therefore it's resolvable. So you can resolve the problems of the world on the question of war. We know that that can happen. We know why you can do it, because we know who the actual enemy is. And we can tell you who it is. Now, it won't be believed by a lot of people, but nonetheless, it's true. And the people that are coming, and I don't mean that Scott and this one and that one are seeking something from us, but it's very simple. They've all found out. They've all had experiences that they never thought they would experience. You know, realize these people are, right? Larry Wilkerson was the chief of staff to Colin Powell, okay? Let's say it this way, because Larry, I don't think would mind. Larry and Colin Powell got a lot of people killed, okay? Got a lot of people killed. And Larry knows that's what happened. And Larry don't want to do that anymore. Ray McGovern's different. Now, he won't be there because he's had some problems, you know, medical problems. But Ray, former CIA, he used to brief Ronald Reagan and George Bush every morning. That's what his job was. In the morning, every day, that's what Ray McGovern did. Okay? Over time, Ray recognized, whoa, this is not what I want to be doing, and not with these people. Okay? Scott Ritter was dealing with people like Saddam Hussein's nephew, who was the one that told him, you know, we really don't have this stuff anymore. I mean, we did have weapons of mass destruction because you guys gave them to us. We used them. We used them on Iraq. We don't have this stuff anymore. And he told him, and you know, he got executed as a result of that. So Ritter's been through this. These are people who have had a certain experience, but more than that, they're fighting in a situation in which they realize that you're in a circumstance where there's a kind of process, a maelstrom, if you want, in which the people that really wish to solve the problem are different than the people that are leading the country. So now what do you do? What do you do? You have to go to the fundamentals of the American Revolution. And that doesn't mean what the militia guys think, which is just get out your gun. That's not the fundamental of the American Revolution. You have to go to the fundamental principle, and that is that you have to assemble the people. And you have to have public deliberation on policy. And hopefully, we'll get this across to enough people, and they'll come out on Saturday. And frankly, whoever comes is who should be there. I mean, I'm not saying that defensively. I'm just telling you that's how you have to roll through life. That's how the LaRouche movement worked. The LaRouche movement has never been a majority kind of thing. It has often, sometimes, won elections or this or that and had people that played certain roles. But it doesn't really operate that way. It operates according to the idea of principle or discovering principle, which doesn't mean we always know what's right. It just means that we're committed to the idea, as was the fisherman, that if you see several things and you try to forecast and you find they're wrong, that there's a way to discover what's right. That's true of the American people too. I don't say that because I want to believe it. I say it because I've seen it. But you have to be present for the American people. You have to represent them. And then what will happen is they'll come out and they will support you and they will ask to do the right thing. But somebody has to stand up for it. And although some people have become famous in history for doing it, there's plenty of people that do it all the time. You never know their names. Okay, that's what this is really about. And so Poe, we think, is like one of our, he's a compadre. That's what he did. Okay, so that's it for this week.
Could I make one
Sure.
idea that you got into my head, is that this is a miniature Dante comedy. Is that was your intention to do that? Because he's on the mountain, he's looking into the, the hell, which is the maelstrom. He's on the mountain, and the people in purgatory don't believe him, and he's got to bring him up to the mountain. It's
Well,
all there.
It's also like Plato's cave,
Yeah.
except you're not in a cave, you're on a mountain. It's an inversion like that too.
And the final thing that he mentions courage. He had to have courage to even be out there in the fishing boat where you could catch a lot of fish. But then, even then, his brother lacked the courage that he did to throw himself out of the boat.
Right. Yes. I mean, the point is his choices. I mean, who knows? I mean, I'm sure I would be. I don't even want to think about what I would do in that situation. You'd be gripped by terror. See, you're gripped by fear. But what if you're gripped by the process? See, that's what happened. He allowed himself to be gripped by the process. That's the difference. His brother was gripped by fear, so he got smaller.
It's also, I mean, you can think about it as there are multiple processes intersecting each other. Because there's a process of this violent jerking gyration motion, and then there's the orthogonal process of the motion downwards towards the abyss. So the fear is the fixation on the violent gyration, and then you're not thinking about the other process. And because he's able to steady himself, he's able to notice this other process, and he's looking down and up, and he's saying, look how this other process is playing out, and how can I actually intervene on that and affect that.
Yes.
Flank it, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
Very good.
And it's all in a short story. Okay.
Okay. This is our end card. End card.
Who wins the beauty contest?